Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're taking another look at the Nancy Guthrie case because several details surrounding her disappearance are raising difficult questions. From surveillance footage to conflicting ransom messages, the timeline leaves some important pieces unexplained. So, let's take a closer look at what investigators have revealed and what still doesn't add up. For more than 6 months, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie has left investigators, her family, and the public with one central question: what happened after she was last confirmed at her home? Now, newly released information is drawing attention to details that were not widely understood at the start of the investigation, including the full text of 2 ransom notes, an FBI description of the suspect caught on camera, and a case that federal officials are now calling one of the most frustrating in recent memory. There are references to ransom communications, surveillance footage, and an unidentified man whose behavior investigators say may indicate preparation before the night Nancy disappeared. There are also questions surrounding the timing of a sheriff's department aircraft and whether a key pilot was available when the search began. None of these details by themselves establishes who took Nancy or what ultimately happened to her. Some of the theories surrounding them remain unconfirmed, but taken together, they create a timeline that deserves a closer look. And perhaps the most important detail is this. Investigators say 2 doorbell camera videos may have come from separate days, and that those recordings could provide clues about what the unidentified man was doing before Nancy was taken. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance did not begin with a dramatic public confrontation. It began with a family member who was suddenly missing. Nancy Guthrie, 84, is the mother of Today's Show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie. She was last confirmed at her residence in the Catalina Foothills, a Tucson suburb, on the evening of January 31, 2026, and was reported missing the next day. By the time the investigation became a national story, questions were already forming about what happened during the hours surrounding her disappearance. One detail that has stuck with investigators: Nancy reportedly failed to appear for a Sunday church livestream that her family says she never missed. That absence is part of what first signaled something was wrong. Nancy's family has continued to appeal for information. Savannah Guthrie has spoken publicly about the emotional toll the disappearance has taken on the family, describing waking each day without knowing what happened to her mother and appealing directly to anyone who might know something to come forward, even anonymously. That appeal is important because the case does not appear to depend on one single piece of evidence. Investigators have been examining surveillance footage, communications, physical clues, and information provided by the public. And as more material has become available, some of the earliest assumptions about the case have been questioned. One of the most significant developments involves 2 videos recovered from Nancy's doorbell camera. The FBI later released images from that footage showing what it described as an armed individual who appeared to tamper with the doorbell camera at Nancy's front door on the morning of her disappearance. Investigators have publicly described the suspect as male, roughly 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches of average build, and carrying a 25-liter backpack. According to the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the 2 videos may have been recorded on separate days. Investigators described them as critical to understanding the behavior and choices of the unidentified man and said the footage indicated he had taken steps to prepare for the events surrounding the night of January 31st into February 1st. That wording matters. Investigators were not simply describing someone who happened to appear near Nancy's home. They were examining behavior that, according to their statement, may have shown preparation beforehand. But there is another part of the timeline that has attracted considerable attention. The evening before her disappearance, Nancy had dinner with family, reportedly arriving by rideshare and later being driven home. A garage door record is described as showing the garage opening at approximately 9:48 p.m. and closing at approximately 9:50 p.m. That creates a 2-minute window. And this is where caution becomes especially important. The 2-minute garage record does not establish what happened inside the home. It does not prove who entered the house, whether Nancy walked inside alone, or whether another person was present. Sheriff Chris Nanos has publicly stated that Nancy was of sound mind, explicitly not a dementia-related disappearance, but has said she has underlying health issues, including reliance on a pacemaker and a medication she cannot safely miss. Still, the timing raises a legitimate investigative question. What exactly happened between the garage door opening and closing? Because investigators looking at a disappearance have to examine precisely these kinds of small windows. Sometimes a timeline is not about what the available evidence proves. It is about what the evidence leaves unexplained. Then there are the ransom communications. 2 ransom notes were sent to media outlets in the days after Nancy's disappearance, one on February 2nd and a second on February 6th, and both reportedly reached the Guthrie family as well. Investigators said the communications displayed distinctive patterns of word choice, syntax, and phraseology. The first communication claimed Nancy was being held for ransom and demanded $4 million in Bitcoin, with a threat that the amount would rise to $6 million if a deadline was missed. It also referenced a possible release location back in Tucson. The second communication was very different. It reportedly claimed Nancy had died shortly after being taken, suggested her death was connected to her heart, and said she had been buried in nature. That contradiction is one of the most difficult aspects of the communications, and it remains unresolved. Whether those messages were written by the same person, whether they were intended to mislead investigators, or whether they represented different stages of an actual event remains an open question. And there is another detail investigators themselves highlighted. The notes reportedly contained information about Nancy that was not necessarily public at the time. Authorities have asked the public to pay attention to people whose behavior changed around the time of Nancy's disappearance, including unexplained injuries, sudden departures, unusual vehicle cleaning or repairs, and unusual knowledge or interest in the investigation. That does not identify a suspect, but it tells us something about the direction of the investigation. Authorities were not only asking who knew Nancy, but whether someone had knowledge an ordinary member of the public would not have had. And then there is the issue surrounding the Sheriff's Department aircraft. Reporting has raised questions about whether a senior pilot capable of operating the department's Cessna had been demoted before Nancy disappeared, leaving the aircraft without an operator on February 1st. Reporting also makes clear there was no suggestion that decision was connected to Nancy's disappearance. That distinction is critical. A personnel decision, even one that appears questionable to observers, is not evidence of involvement in Nancy's disappearance. What it does raise is a fair question about search preparedness in the earliest hours. The ransom communications introduced another layer of uncertainty into the investigation. The first message, reportedly sent February 2nd, demanded $4 million in Bitcoin with an escalating deadline. It also reportedly included specific details tied to Nancy's home and belongings, including a smartwatch found near her bed and damage to a backyard floodlight, details that potentially connect the writer to information about the house, though the source of that knowledge has never been publicly established. Knowing a detail does not necessarily mean the writer personally entered the house. It could have come from surveillance, from another person, or from information later determined to be publicly available. That is exactly what investigators would have needed to establish. The second communication, sent February 6th, addressed the Guthrie family and struck a very different tone. It claimed the writers hadn't understood Nancy's physical condition, hadn't intended to hurt her, and that she had died shortly after being taken, allegedly from a heart-related cause. That is a direct contradiction of the first note's premise that Nancy was alive and could be ransomed. A ransom note can contain facts, lies, or a mixture of both. The challenge for investigators and for anyone examining this case responsibly is determining which is which. That is why investigators' public request for information matters, and why it can also be a double-edged tool. Reports of unusual behavior can generate a large number of well-meaning but ultimately unconnected leads. Someone acting nervous, changing their appearance, or leaving town is not, on its own, evidence of anything. A friend of the Guthrie family has said family members asked friends and colleagues not to speak publicly about the case, despite offers from national outlets. The most reasonable read of that decision, though it isn't confirmed by the family itself, is an attempt to protect the investigation rather than conceal anything, since public statements in an active case can create confusion or tip off a subject about what investigators do or don't know. The surveillance footage remains one of the most important pieces of evidence in this case, not because it gives the public the full picture, but because of what investigators say it may show about the unidentified man's preparation. Investigators have said the two doorbell recordings may have come from separate days and are important to understanding the man's behavior and choices, and that they indicate he may have taken steps to prepare in advance. The FBI's public description: male, 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches, average build, carrying an Ozark Trail hiker backpack, appearing armed and tampering with a camera, is the most concrete public detail available. What that footage does not do is name the man, establish a motive, or confirm that every action seen on camera was connected to Nancy's disappearance. Online speculation has also pointed to spikes in Google search trends for terms related to the case in states including Colorado, Wyoming, Texas, and Oregon. That kind of data is not an investigative tool. It doesn't identify who searched, why, or whether it has anything to do with this case. It's worth being skeptical of any theory built primarily on search trend graphs. More than 6 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the case remains unsolved and no suspect has been publicly named. On August 1, 2026, day 181 of the investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Department made a significant move. It released the full text of both ransom notes to the public, hoping someone might recognize the writer's phrasing, syntax, or word choices. That's the same distinctive patterns investigators had referenced early on, now put directly in front of millions of people instead of held back. The case has not been quiet since. A few developments worth tracking. A person of interest was briefly detained. In February, delivery driver Carlos Palazuelos was taken in by the Pima County Sheriff's Department in connection with the case and released roughly 8 hours later, without charge. His attorney has since publicly pushed the department to release the search warrant affidavit and explain what led investigators to him, and has called on the sheriff to formally clear him. Sheriff Nanos has defended the process, saying investigators presented evidence to a judge who authorized the warrant. As of this update, Palazuelos has not been charged with anything, and it would be inaccurate to characterize him as a suspect. The FBI is analyzing mixed DNA evidence recovered from Nancy's home, though no results have been made public. A combined reward of more than $1.2 million is now being offered for information leading to Nancy's safe return. Newly confirmed Attorney General Todd Blanche addressed the case publicly for the first time in weeks on NBC's Meet the Press on August 16th, calling it a heartbreaking situation as it entered its 7th month with no new leads. A source close to the investigation told Axios in early August that the case appears stalled, with no suspects or major leads, and growing pressure to solve it. A forensic psychologist, Dr. Chris Mohandai, publicly raised doubts about the ransom note's legitimacy, suggesting the case could ultimately trace back to a burglary that went wrong followed by an attempted cover-up, one theory among several, not a confirmed finding. Separately, the Pima County Sheriff's Department issued a wanted alert for a 40-year-old woman, Coral Michelle Smith, in connection with an unrelated kidnapping and aggravated assault case that happened less than 7 miles from Nancy's home. Investigators have not indicated any link between that case and Nancy's disappearance, and it should not be treated as one. Some neighbors have reported camera glitches around Nancy's street, which outlets have reported experts attributing to possible Wi-Fi jamming, an unconfirmed detail, but one that has renewed attention to how deliberate the events around February 1st may have been. Taken together, the last few weeks haven't produced a suspect or a location, but they have produced more raw material for the public and investigators alike. The ransom notes themselves, a clear timeline of law enforcement's early missteps, and a federal spotlight that suggests this case isn't fading from view. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has produced a timeline filled with unanswered questions, and more than 6 months later, most of the biggest ones are still open. There is the surveillance footage investigators say may show an unidentified man preparing before the night Nancy disappeared, now paired with a public FBI description of that man. There are the 2 ransom notes, now released in full to the public, containing very different accounts of what happened to her. There is the narrow garage door window on the night Nancy was last confirmed at home. There is a person of interest who is detained and released without charge, and whose attorney is still demanding answers. And there are questions about the early search response that have generated public criticism, even though the available material does not establish that any personnel decision was connected to Nancy's disappearance. We still do not know who the man in the footage is. We still do not know what happened inside Nancy's home after the garage door closed. And we still cannot establish whether the claims in the ransom notes were truthful, deliberately misleading, or something investigators haven't yet explained publicly. For Nancy's family, the uncertainty is more than an investigative puzzle. They have continued asking anyone with information to come forward, including people who may be afraid, conflicted, or unsure whether what they know matters. And that may ultimately be what breaks the case open. Not another theory online, but one verified piece of information that connects the timeline. So the question I want to leave you with is this. What do you believe investigators should focus on most? The unidentified man seen in the surveillance footage, the newly released ransom notes, or the 6 months of silence in between? If you found this breakdown helpful, consider subscribing as we continue following the publicly reported developments in the Nancy Guthrie case. For now, one question remains above all others. What happened to Nancy Guthrie after she was last confirmed at her home? And who knows the missing part of that story? Sources referenced for the August 2026 update: NBC News, Axios, ABC News, Men's Journal, Stylecaster, TV Insider, News Nation, and the Pima County Sheriff's Department's public statements. All disputed or unconfirmed claims, theories, person of interest status, DNA results, camera glitch cause, are flagged as such above and should be treated as developing, not settled, facts.